Welcome back for the second day of the Lora Sewalong. Today we are going to be diving into the bodice. I'm using a bodice for the spaghetti strap view. If you are using a bodice for the sleeved view, just know that the instructions are the same today no matter what view you are sewing, even if your bodice looks a little bit different than mine. Now the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to sew 2 lines of gathering stitches. So that means lengthening your stitch to around 4 or 5 millimeters long, and you're going to do those along the underbust, and you'll do 2 lines of stitching, one at 3/8 of an inch and one at 5/8 of an inch from the raw edge. The reason that we do that is that places them on either side of the normal 1/2 inch seam allowance, which just gives you a lot of control in keeping those gathers even. So we're going to do that between the 2 gathering notches at the bottom of the front bodice. When you stitch them, you do not backstitch. You're going to leave long thread tails, and that's going to help you gather them later. Okay, now that those gathering stitches are there, we are going to attach the back bodice to the front bodice. Now, one thing I should probably clarify here is that we are doing these to the main bodice pieces and not to the lining bodice pieces. Hopefully you have marked those. The lining bodice piece is a little bit smaller around the neckline in the center front. And this little bit of difference helps your bodice to curve nicely around your bust area and the neckline to the inside. Okay, so we're pinning the side seams of the front bodice to the back bodice, matching up notches and with right sides touching. Then we're going to go over to our sewing machine and we're going to stitch that at a normal 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, now that that is stitched, we're going to press the seam allowances open. Because the bodice is fully lined, you do not need to finish these seam allowances. So just go ahead and press them open. If you need to reduce bulk, you can do that by trimming them down if you have a slightly thicker fabric. Okay, now that the main bodice is all assembled, we're going to do the exact same thing to the lining pieces. So like I said, my lining pieces are a different color so that it's pretty clear what is what, but yours might look more similar, so just be really careful that you're marking and keeping track of what is your lining and what is your main bodice. Okay, you can go ahead and put that lining aside for now because now we are going to attach the main bodice to the main skirt. So go ahead and grab that skirt that we had set aside before. And then you'll pin the bottom of the bodice to the top of the skirt with right sides touching. You can start by pinning the side seams, and then the notches on the back bodice match up with the darts on the back skirt. Next, I like to pin the little angled area at the top of the skirt to the front bodice, so that should fit quite nicely. And then you are going to start pulling on your gathering stitches so that you can match the notches on either side of your gathering on the bodice to the gathering notches at the top of the skirt. Once I'm happy with the width of my gathering, I like to do a little figure 8 with my loose threads around a pin, and that helps just kind of lock the width of those gathering stitches in place, and then you can more easily adjust the gathers so that they look nice and even and pretty. One other thing I like to do is I actually press my gathers before stitching. This kind of helps flatten them, lock them in place, and you're just going to get a better result when you're stitching if it is pressed first. And then we go over to our sewing machine and we stitch at a normal 1/2 inch seam allowance. So you should be stitching right between those 2 lines of gathering stitches. Okay, here it is all attached together. It's starting to look a little bit like a dress now that the bodice is attached to the skirt portion. If your fabric is a little bit on the bulky side, you might want to grade these seams. I don't find that necessary in this really lightweight fabric. If you are going to go ahead and grade those seams, what I recommend is that You trim the main bodice seam allowance down to about 3/8 of an inch and the skirt to about 1/4 of an inch. You also want to go ahead and remove any visible basting stitches at this point so that those are just out of your way and not visible on the right side of your garment. And now we're pressing all of the seam allowances up towards the bodice. Once again, these are going to be completely encased because we're fully lining the bodice, so you don't need to worry about finishing these seams. Now we need to go ahead and get our lining again. We are going to gather the bodice lining using the underbust basting stitches, and we're going to match those to the main bodice. So there's a couple ways that you can do this. One, you can just lay it on top of the main bodice and just make sure that they're gathered to the same width. I know that this can be a little bit finicky, but what we're essentially trying to do is just make sure that the bottom of the bodice lining is the exact same length as the bodice of your main bodice. Another way that you can do this is you can just grab a ruler and you can actually just measure the length between those two notches, and then you can go measure the gathering and just make sure that it matches that same measurement. Once you're happy with the gathering width, I do like to go ahead and lock in those stitches once again so that they don't grow when you're stitching. So just like on the main bodice, I like to put in a pin and I like to do a little figure 8 around that pin to lock in the width. And then once that is done, then I adjust the gathers so that they're nice and pretty and evenly distributed, and then I like to press it. So once again, those are kind of pressed into place and they're not going to move around a ton later. Okay, the next thing that you need to grab are your front facing pieces. So with the wrong side facing up, we are going to turn in the long unnotched edge by 1/4 of an inch towards the wrong side, or wrong side's touching, and we're going to go ahead and press that. And then once we've pressed that all the way along that long edge, we're going to go over to our sewing machine and we're actually going to just stitch that just inside that 1/4 of an inch, or like at a scant 1/4 of an inch, to secure that fold into place. Okay, we're now going to pin the front facing to the bottom of the bodice lining. So take your bodice lining and place it so that it's right sides up, and then you're going to take your front facing and make sure you have the right one. You might need to try it a couple times to make sure that you have the one that coordinates with the side that you're using. And you're actually, with right sides touching, pinning the top angled edge to that corner of the center front of the bodice lining. It should look something like this when you're pinning it. And now you're going to stitch along the entire bottom of the bodice lining, and this is going to do a few things. It's going to attach the facings to the bodice. It's also going to lock in the gathering at the underbust and also create a fold line for the lining. Now you're going to press the seam allowances of the facings and also the bottom edge of the lining up by 1/2 an inch towards the wrong side. So essentially you are pressing it up along that stitch line that you just made. Once again, this can feel like a teeny bit finicky, especially around those gathers, but the nice thing about this is going to create a nice clean edge on the inside of your dress to fully line the bodice. Okay, we can go ahead and set aside that lining and facing for now and go ahead and grab your button shield. So there's just one of these, and you're going to fold it in half lengthwise, right sides touching, and go ahead and pin the top and bottom edges, and then we're going to go over to our sewing machine and we are going to stitch at a normal 1/2 inch seam allowance along those top edges. Go ahead and trim those seam allowances to reduce any bulk, turn it right side out, and then press the whole thing in half so that you now have one long folded button shield. Okay, you can set that button shield aside, and now it's time to grab your button loop pieces. So you should have 2 of those, and it should be cut on the bias. Do not mistake these for your strap pieces because they could look similar, so just make sure it's the ones that are cut on the bias. So fold it in half lengthwise, right sides touching, and then stitch it 3/16 of an inch from the folded edge or 1/2 inch from the raw edges. We have a whole blog post on turning these skinny loops. I like 3/16 of an inch, but I know that this can be a little bit tight for some people, especially if your fabric is a little bit thicker. You could always go up to 1/4 of an inch from the folded edge if you want a little bit more room and just to make it a little bit easier on yourself. Trim down those seam allowances pretty close to the stitch line at about 1/16 of an inch. And then you need to turn it right side out. So once again, we have a whole blog post on this. I like to use this loop turner. I find it to be the easiest way. Starting it is always the hardest, but once you get going, it's not too bad. You can also use a hand sewing needle, knot it to one end, and then loop it back eye end first to turn it right side out. And then you're going to want to trim those button loops into 12 2-inch sections, and you will have extra, so feel free to trim off little bits that don't look as nice. Fold each of those little 2-inch loops into a U shape. You can use your iron and steam setting to really set the shape in place. So now we're going to grab our main dress and we're going to lay it down with the right side facing up, and we're going to be working on the right side of the dress, or the right side when wearing. And we need to attach your button loops to the center front of your dress, and they are going to be marked every 2 inches down the front of the dress. The very first one is just below that dot on the center front of the bodice, and then, like I said, every 2 inches down. I like to use a Crayola marker, but that is just my personal preference. Next, we're going to attach the button loops. Now, the instructions say pin, I mentioned pin, but what I actually find the easiest way to attach these is to use a glue stick. So I use these washable glue sticks. Once again, I'm a fan of Crayola products in sewing. I find if it's good enough for my preschooler, it is going to wash out of my fabric, or so that has been the case so far. So what I do is I just go along those markings, which are every 2 inch, and I put just a little dab of the glue stick, and then I place my button loop on there, and once it dries, it is basted in place. Now you'll notice that the raw edges of the loop are lined up with the raw edges of the center front. So the loop part is actually facing in towards the dress, or the top of the U is. And that's because once we stitch it all together and then we flip it right side out, then it will be pressed towards the center front. Now, if you did not use a glue stick like I did and you pinned them, then now you are going to want to go over to your sewing machine and you will actually baste that in place at 1/2 inch. Now go over to the left edge, or the left edge of the dress when we're wearing it, and we are going to pin the button shield along this edge with the raw edges lining up, and the very top of the button shield is going to be placed just below that bodice dot. And once we get that all pinned, we'll go over to our sewing machine and we are going to baste that in place at 1/2 inch seam allowance. And that is it for today. So tomorrow we're gonna be working on the spaghetti strap views some more. If you are sewing up one of the sleeved views, you can skip tomorrow and come back on day 4 of the sew along.